The road to Nord-Shel didn't just end, it surrendered. The cracked asphalt simply gave up, swallowed by gray weeds and a thick, choking dust. I killed the engine of my old SUV, and in that heartbeat, the silence hit me like a physical weight. Not a peaceful silence, not the kind you find in the countryside. This was a vacuum. It felt as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of this place 30 years ago and never let it back in. I stood before a rusted gate. A sign hung there, swaying slightly despite the lack of wind. Object 402, entry strictly prohibited, danger of collapse. The paint was blistered and peeling like sunburnt skin. Beyond that gate lay nowhere. My name is Maxim Sokolov. On paper, I'm an archival researcher, but my employer, a man whose voice I've only heard through encrypted channels, calls it truth extraction. His instructions were blunt. Nord-Shel, shift 402, find their manifests. According to the official 1994 reports, there was a catastrophe here, a methane leak in the lower levels of the northern mine. The city was evacuated within 24 hours. People were told to leave everything: furniture, clothes, memories. It's temporary, the loudspeakers promised. That temporary has stretched into 30 years. But here's the thing. If this place is so lethal, why are the motion sensors along the perimeter still blinking with faint red lights? Who is changing the batteries? I climbed over the fence. The gravel crunched under my boots, each step echoing in my ears like a hammer blow. Ahead, the outlines of 5-story apartment blocks began to emerge from the fog. Standard Soviet-era panelkas, gray and hollow, with window frames like empty eye sockets. In some, the remains of curtains still hung, tattered gray rags that didn't even shiver. There was no wind here. The air was stagnant, like the inside of a tomb. On the wall of the nearest building, I saw faded graffiti. "We are still here." The paint looked fresher than anything else around it. I stepped into the courtyard of Building 4 on Miners Street. A child's tricycle, a rusted gnome model, stood right in the middle. The rust was so thick the wheels had literally fused into the asphalt. Nearby lay a headless doll, its plastic eyes staring at the overcast sky with a silent, haunting accusation. I entered the first stairwell. The smell hit me immediately. Dampness, old paper, and something sickly sweet. The scent of decay. I climbed to the 4th floor, apartment 12. The door wasn't just open. It had been ripped off its hinges as if something had been desperate to get in. Or get out. I walked into the kitchen. Shards of plates and scraps of newspapers from August '94 littered the floor. But my eyes locked onto the table. There sat a mug. Simple, with a blue rim. Inside was the dark, dried residue of coffee. But next to it lay a spoon. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on. A thick layer of gray dust, maybe 2 centimeters deep, covered the entire table. But the spoon was clean. Not a single speck of dust touched the polished metal. Someone had pulled it out of that mug recently. An hour ago. 10 minutes. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. I turned slowly. In the corner of the kitchen stood an old Biryusa refrigerator. On its door there were plastic magnet letters. They were arranged in a row. I leaned in to read them. Leave. I froze. My pulse hammered in my ears. This couldn't have been left 30 years ago. The letters gleamed in the flashlight beam as clean as the spoon. I didn't run. In a place like Nord-Shell, running is the worst thing you can do. The sound of your own frantic breathing and the heavy thud of your boots against the hollow floorboards would drown out whatever might be creeping up behind you. I stood perfectly still in that kitchen, my flashlight beam trembling slightly on the word Leave. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was expectant. I backed out of the apartment, keeping my eyes on the dark hallway. My shadow, long and distorted, danced on the peeling wallpaper. Every floorboard I stepped on groaned like a dying animal. It's a sound you never get used to. The sound of a building slowly collapsing under the weight of its own secrets. Just as I reached the stairwell, it happened again. Thump. A low subterranean vibration. It wasn't a sound you hear with your ears. It was a frequency you feel in your teeth and your ribcage. It came from deep below, from the throat of the northern mine. Thump. It was rhythmic. 5 seconds of silence, then a pulse, like the heartbeat of a giant buried alive. I looked at the dust on the floor. It was dancing, jumping in tiny gray fountains with every beat. This wasn't a tectonic shift. This was machinery. Heavy, industrial, and impossibly deep. I made it back to the street. The fog had thickened, turning the gray buildings into jagged ghosts. I kept my flashlight low, aimed at the ground. You don't want to be a lighthouse in a city of shadows. I headed toward the administration building, the Stalinka, with the frozen clock. To get there, I had to cross the main park. What used to be a place for families was now a twisted forest of overgrown weeds and rusted iron. A Ferris wheel stood at the edge of the park, its yellow cabins dangling like rotted fruit. As I walked past it, a gust of wind, the first one since I arrived, caught the wheel. It didn't speak. It just groaned. A long, high-pitched metallic squeak that tore through the stagnant air. I dropped to one knee, my heart racing. In the darkness, about 50 yards ahead, I heard a metallic clink, like a wrench hitting a pipe. Then silence. "Is anyone there?" I whispered. My voice sounded small, pathetic against the backdrop of the dead city. No answer. Only the heartbeat from below. Thump. 35 minutes to 42 minutes. The threshold of the beast. I reached the heavy oak doors of the administration building. They were scarred with deep gouges, as if someone had tried to claw their way in or out with their bare fingernails. I pushed. The hinges shrieked, a sound that surely echoed for miles. I stepped into the grand lobby. The beam of my light cut through the darkness, illuminating a massive mosaic on the far wall. A miner holding a piece of coal that looked more like a black heart. The air here was freezing. My breath came out in thick white plumes. I looked at the floor and froze. In the thick layer of dust, there were tracks, not human footprints, drag marks. Something heavy had been pulled across this floor recently, leaving a wide, smooth trail that led straight to the elevator shaft. I followed the trail. As I got closer to the shaft, the rhythmic thumping from below grew louder. It was accompanied by a new sound now, a faint, rhythmic clicking. Click, clack, click, clack, like a telegraph or an old typewriter. I reached the elevator. The doors were pried open. I leaned over the edge, shining my light down into the abyss. The cables were gone. But something else was there, glittering in the dark, hundreds of feet below, were thousands of tiny, glowing blue points of light. They were moving. The elevator shaft was a throat. and the blue lights below were something it had swallowed but couldn't digest. I backed away, my boots scraping against the marble floor of the lobby. Every sound I made felt like a flare launched into the dark. I needed to get to the third floor, room 305. The chief engineer's office. According to my employer, that's where the real manifest for shift 402 was kept. Not the one filed in the state archives, but the one written in blood and sweat. I took the stairs. The grand staircase was a ruin of its former self. The red carpet had rotted into a black, slick mold that smelled of ancient wet earth. Stip. Pause. Listen. On the second floor landing, I stopped. My flashlight beam hit a row of portraits on the wall. The heroes of labor. Men with soot-stained faces and forced smiles. But someone had gone through the trouble of scratching out their eyes. Every single one. Just jagged white gouges where the pupils should be. It didn't look like a random act of vandalism. It looked like a ritual. As I reached the third floor, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. My fingers were becoming numb inside my tactical gloves. I turned the corner into the main hallway, and that's when I saw it. The flashlight beam from before. It wasn't a person. At the end of the long corridor, a single emergency lamp was swinging from a loose wire. It shouldn't have had power. None of this should have had power, but it was flickering with a rhythmic, stuttering pulse. Short, long, short. Morse code? Or just the dying gasps of a generator that refused to quit? I reached the door. The brass plaque was tarnished, but I could still make out the name, V.E. Volkov, chief engineer. The door was unlocked. It swung open with a groan that felt like it lasted a century. Inside, the office was a time capsule. A heavy oak desk, a rotary phone, and stacks upon stacks of paper, yellowed and brittle. I moved to the filing cabinet. It was locked. I didn't have time for finesse, so I used a small crowbar from my pack. The metal shrieked as I pried the drawer open. Dust exploded into the air, dancing in my light like tiny, frantic insects. I flipped through the folders. Production quotas, safety violations, personnel files, and then a thick black leather-bound ledger. No title, no date. I opened it. The first few pages were standard logs. But as I reached August 1994, the handwriting changed. It became frantic, the ink bleeding through the paper. They aren't digging for coal anymore, the entry read. The drills hit something at level 9. Something that doesn't show up on the sonars. It's hollow, but it's dense. It's breathing. Shift 402 went down to seal the breach. They haven't signaled in 72 hours. Command tells us to stay quiet. They say the town is being reassigned. God help us, we can hear them screaming through the ventilation pipes. A cold draft hit the back of my neck. Not from the window. From the door I had just closed. I froze. I didn't turn my head. I didn't move a muscle. In the reflection of the glass-fronted bookshelf in front of me, I saw the doorway. The hallway light flickered. Short, long, short. And for a fraction of a second, a silhouette was visible. It was tall, impossibly thin. It wasn't wearing a hazmat suit or a uniform. It was draped in what looked like heavy, wet canvas. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, pale surface where features should be, reflecting my own flashlight beam back at me. It didn't attack. It just stood there, tilting its head at an unnatural angle. And then, the rotary phone on the desk, the one that hadn't been connected to a line in 30 years, began to ring. Being. The sound was deafening in the dead silence of Nord-Shel. Being. I reached for my belt for the flare gun. My heart was a drum, matching the thump of the mine below. The figure in the doorway raised a hand. It pointed not at me, but at the phone. "Answer it," a voice whispered. But it didn't come from the figure. It came from the speakers of the intercom system on the wall, crackling with static and age. "Answer it, Maxim. We've been waiting for the report." The phone didn't stop. Its ringing was a jagged blade, cutting through the thick, stagnant air of the office. I didn't answer it. I couldn't. My hand frozen inches from the receiver. I watched the silhouette in the doorway dissolve back into the flickering shadows of the hallway. I grabbed the black ledger, shoved it into my pack, and ran. Not toward the stairs. The stairs were a trap now. I ran toward the service lift at the back of the building. It was a cage of rusted iron, suspended by cables that looked like frayed nerves. I hit the button. I expected nothing. But with a mechanical groan that shook the entire floor, the lift shuddered to life. The blue lights I'd seen from the lobby weren't just reflections. They were a trail. As the lift descended, the world of the surface disappeared. The air turned metallic, tasting of copper and ozone. Down, past level 1, past the administrative archives, past the storage bunkers. Level 9. The doors didn't open. They collapsed outward. I stepped out into a cathedral of rock. This wasn't a coal mine anymore. The walls were covered in a substance that looked like obsidian. Black, glass-like and warm to the touch. And everywhere, those blue points of light. They weren't lamps. They were bioluminescent fungi, or perhaps something even stranger, growing in the cracks of the stone. The rhythmic thump was deafening here. It was no longer a sound. It was a physical force that pushed against my chest. Thump, thump. I followed the drag marks. They led to the center of the cavern, where a massive drilling rig stood abandoned. Its diamond-tipped bit was buried deep into a wall of white, translucent material. The breach mentioned in the ledger. I shone my light on the rig. There were clothes scattered around it, not old rotted rags from 1994, but modern tactical gear. Helmets, boots, radios, all empty. It looked as if the people wearing them had simply evaporated, leaving their equipment behind in neat piles. And then I saw the drill bit. It was moving. Slowly, agonizingly, it was being pulled into the white wall. The wall wasn't stone. It was soft. It was pulsing. I reached into my bag and pulled out a chemical light stick. I cracked it, filled the cavern with a harsh green glow, and threw it toward the breach. As the light hit the white surface, I saw them. Thousands of faces, pressed against the inside of the translucent wall like insects, trapped in amber. They weren't dead. Their eyes were open, glowing with that same faint blue light. I saw the miners from 1994. I saw men in Soviet uniforms. And then, my blood turned to ice. I saw a face I recognized, a man who had disappeared 2 weeks ago. A colleague I thought was on vacation in Europe. They weren't screaming. Their mouths were moving in unison, silent and rhythmic, matching the heartbeat of the mine. They were part of it now, a biological processor, a living archive. The intercom on the wall of the cavern crackled. The same voice from the office, hollow, distorted, ancient, spoke again. The truth isn't something you find, Maxim. It's something you join. Shift 402 didn't fail. They succeeded. They became the first layers of the new memory. I felt a sharp pain in the back of my neck. I reached back and pulled out a small metallic needle. A drone. A trap. My vision began to blur. The blue lights started to dance, spinning into a vortex. The white wall began to ripple. A hand, pale, thin, and impossibly long, reached out from the surface, inviting me in. I'm writing this into my digital recorder now. I don't think I'll make it back to the lift. The air is getting thicker. It's starting to feel like water. If you're listening to this, if this recording ever makes it out of Nord-Shel, don't come looking for the truth. Some things are buried for a reason, not to protect us from them, but to keep them fed. The heartbeat is getting faster now. Thump, thump, thump. Thump, thump, thump. It's not a heart anymore. It's a countdown. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey into the depths of Nord-Shel. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like, subscribe, and share your theories in the comments. Your support keeps these mysteries alive. Until next time.